At my granddaughter's dance recital, my son-in-law's brother walked up to her backstage, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "You were the worst one out there. Everyone was watching you trip over yourself." My 8-year-old granddaughter stood there in her pink tutu, lip trembling, eyes filling up. Her father, my daughter's husband, was standing 3 feet away. He laughed. Actually laughed. "Uncle Donnie's just being honest, sweetheart. Maybe dance isn't your thing." My jaw tightened. My hands went still. Not from helplessness, from 34 years of learning exactly when to speak and when to wait. I excused myself, walked to the parking lot, and made 2 phone calls. They had absolutely no idea who I was. Before we go further, if stories like this mean something to you, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Now let me tell you everything. My daughter Claire had been married to my son-in-law Marcus for 6 years. In that time, I had watched a bright, funny, fiercely independent woman slowly disappear into someone I barely recognized. She used to call me every Sunday morning. We'd talk for an hour, sometimes 2, about everything and nothing. Books she was reading, problems at her job, memories from when she was growing up. Those calls stopped about 3 years into her marriage. I told myself it was normal. People get busy. Lives get full. I told myself a lot of things. Marcus came from what his family called old Savannah money, which meant they'd had it long enough to confuse wealth with worthiness. His mother, Beverly, presided over family gatherings the way a general commands a battlefield with total authority and 0 tolerance for deviation. His older brother Donald, who went by Donnie to everyone except Beverly, who called him her pride, ran the family's commercial real estate business and treated every social situation like a negotiation he intended to win. I had met them for the first time at Claire and Marcus's engagement dinner and had understood immediately the kind of family my daughter was marrying into. The kind where approval is currency and silence is expected from anyone without a seat at the table they'd decided mattered. I had never been given a seat at that table. I lived in a 2-bedroom house in Beaufort, South Carolina, about 90 minutes from their place in Savannah. I drove a 10-year-old pickup truck. I wore simple clothes and kept my lawn neat, and didn't talk much at family events unless someone spoke to me first. Beverly had assessed me at that first dinner with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent decades sorting people into categories of useful and irrelevant. I was clearly the latter. She'd smiled at me the way you smile at furniture, pleasantly enough, without actually seeing it. Marcus had followed his mother's lead, as he did in most things. He was never outright cruel to me. He was something worse, indifferent. The kind of indifferent that signals to everyone around you that a person simply doesn't register. He called me by my first name, Robert, delivered in a tone that managed to make even that feel dismissive. Claire would sometimes catch my eye when he did it and give me a small apologetic look. I would give her a small reassuring one back. We'd been having that silent conversation for years. I had retired 3 years earlier from a position I never discussed in their company. After 34 years as a senior special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, I had walked away quietly, moved back to Beaufort where I'd grown up, and started living the kind of slow, uncomplicated life I'd earned. Old colleagues still called me regularly. My network across federal law enforcement, the IRS Criminal Division, state attorneys, general offices, and half a dozen regulatory bodies remained intact and active. I simply saw no reason to mention any of it in settings where people had already decided what I was. People show you exactly who they are when they believe you can't do anything about it. Beverly and Donnie and Marcus had been showing me for 6 years. I had been taking careful note. The recital was at the Savannah Arts Academy on a Saturday afternoon in March. My granddaughter Sophie had been taking dance lessons for 2 years. She loved it the way children love things that are entirely their own, with complete, unself-conscious joy. She wasn't the most technically gifted child in the class, and she knew it, and it didn't matter to her at all. She danced because it made her feel alive. I had driven up that morning, arriving early enough to bring her flowers before she got into costume. Sunflowers, her favorite. She'd thrown her arms around my neck and said, "Grandpa Robert, you always remember." Claire had met me at the entrance. She looked tired in the particular way that goes deeper than sleep. Her hair was pulled back, and she was wearing a dress I recognized from 3 years ago, I remembered, because she'd bought it for a birthday dinner and had spun around in my kitchen asking if it was too much. She didn't spin anymore. She stood carefully, like someone who had learned to take up less space. "I'm glad you came, Dad," she said. "Wouldn't miss it," I told her. Which was true. Which would always be true. Marcus greeted me with a handshake and his eyes already somewhere else. Donnie arrived 20 minutes later with his wife Renata and their 2 teenagers, who ignored Sophie entirely. Beverly came in just before the show started, making an entrance the way she always did, working the room with handshakes and air kisses, finding me eventually, and offering a smile that communicated polite tolerance. "Robert, how was the drive up?" "Easy," I said. "Beautiful morning for it." She was already looking past me. The recital itself was everything it should have been. 40 children in various states of coordination, beaming with the particular confidence of people who don't yet know they're supposed to be embarrassed. Sophie's group came on in the 3rd segment. She was in the 2nd row, a little off the beat at one point, catching herself and laughing at her own stumble. I was on my feet before the applause finished. The trouble happened backstage afterward, in the narrow corridor where families were gathering to collect their children. I had just reached Sophie, was kneeling down to give her the sunflowers, when Donnie appeared behind her. He'd had 2 glasses of whatever was in that flask he thought no one noticed and was in the mood to perform. He looked at my granddaughter with the studied amusement of a man who has never once in his life considered whether his words might land like stones. "Well," he said, loudly enough for the families around us to hear, "I've seen a lot of recitals. That was rough, kid. You were off the whole time. Everybody noticed." Sophie's face didn't crumble immediately. There was a moment where I watched her try to decide if he was joking, if this was the kind of thing adults said that meant something other than what it sounded like. Then she understood that it meant exactly what it sounded like, and her lips started to tremble. I was already straightening up when Marcus stepped in from my left. He laughed. A short, easy laugh, like this was a minor thing, a normal thing, a thing that didn't require any response other than deflection. "Uncle Donnie's just keeping it real, Soph. You've got to develop thicker skin if you're going to perform." "She's 8 years old," Claire said quietly from behind him. Her voice was steady, but I could hear what it cost her. "Which is exactly why now is the time to learn," Marcus said, not looking at her. Sophie was crying now, quietly, with her flowers pressed against her chest. Around us, other families had gone carefully silent. Donnie was already turning away, uninterested in the aftermath of what he'd detonated. I placed my hand gently on Sophie's shoulder. "Go find your teacher and get changed, sweetheart," I said. "I'll be right here when you come out." She looked up at me with wet eyes. "The sunflowers are beautiful," I said, "just like you were up there." She went. I straightened up fully and looked at Marcus for a long moment. He met my gaze with the mild incomprehension of someone who cannot imagine being held accountable by furniture. "She needs to toughen up, Robert. The world isn't going to coddle her." "Excuse me," I said. My voice was very calm. "I need some air." I walked out through the side exit into the parking lot. The March air was cool and smelled like rain coming. I stood beside my truck, took 3 slow breaths, and made the first call. Danny. Danny Kowalski had been my partner for 11 years at the Financial Crimes Unit before moving to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in Atlanta. We had lunch twice a year and talked on the phone more than that. "I need you to run a name for me. Donald Whitfield, Commercial Real Estate, Savannah. His mother's company is Whitfield Property Group. Social? I'll text you what I have. And Danny, when you find something, and I think you will, call me before you move on it. I want to make sure it goes to the right people." "You retired, Bob." "I did. This is personal." A pause. "Text me the information." The second call was to a woman named Patricia Odom, who had been a supervising attorney in the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division for 15 years, and who owed me a professional courtesy that dated back to a case we'd worked jointly in 2009. "Pat, it's Robert Calloway. I'm going to send you something in the next few days about a property management company in Savannah. I have reason to believe there are tenant complaints that haven't been properly aggregated. I'd like the right set of eyes on it." "How good is the reason?" 34 years good. "Send it when you have it." I put my phone in my pocket and went back inside to wait for my granddaughter. Sophie came out of the dressing room in her regular clothes, flowers still in hand, face washed clean. I took her hand and we walked together to find Claire. Beverly intercepted us near the exit, effusive now in the way she became after performances were over and the social work was finished. "Sophie, darling, you were wonderful." The lie came out smooth and practiced. Sophie looked at her grandmother-in-law with 8-year-old directness. "Uncle Donnie said I was the worst one." Beverly's smile flickered for less than a second. "Donnie was just teasing. Sweetheart. He has a strange sense of humor." I watched Claire watch her mother-in-law smoothly rewrite what had happened. I watched my daughter nod slightly, because that was what she had learned to do. I put my arm around Claire's shoulders and felt the tension in them, the permanent held-breath tension of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to exhale. "I'm taking you and Sophie to dinner," I said to Claire. "Just us." Marcus appeared at her elbow. "We have dinner plans with my family tonight." "Claire can make her own plans," I said. Still calm, still even. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not quite surprise, something closer to the particular irritation of a person who isn't used to being spoken to as an equal. "Excuse me?" "Dinner," I said. "Claire and Sophie and I. You're welcome to join us, Marcus, but they're coming." Claire looked between us. Then she looked at me, and something I hadn't seen in her eyes in a very long time moved across her face, something that looked like relief, and something that looked like the girl who used to call me every Sunday. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "Sophie, get your jacket." Marcus said nothing. Donnie, across the room, wasn't paying attention. Beverly watched with carefully arranged neutrality as Claire and Sophie walked out with me. At dinner that night, a fish place I'd looked up near the waterfront, wooden tables and paper napkins and Sophie ordering shrimp. For the first time, my granddaughter ate half her plate, and then told me in complete seriousness that she'd decided she wanted to be a marine biologist and a dancer. "Both?" I said. "Dolphins can dance," she said, as though this settled the matter. Claire laughed. A real laugh. Short, a little surprised by itself. Sophie looked pleased and reached for more shrimp. Later, after Sophie fell asleep in the back seat on the drive to their house, Claire spoke quietly from the passenger seat. "Dad, what happened in the parking lot?" "I got some air. You were on your phone." "I was." She looked out the window at the Savannah streetlights. "What did you do?" I thought about how to answer that. I made sure that the right people became aware of some things that deserve attention. Silence. Then, "What kinds of things?" "The kinds of things that don't go away on their own. The kinds of things that have been ignored because the people involved believed no one was watching." More silence. "Dad," her voice was very careful. "Who are you exactly? I mean, I know who you are, but I'm realizing I might not know what you did for 34 years. I'd chosen not to tell her, the same way Harold Whitmore chose not to tell his daughter. Not because I was ashamed or secretive for its own sake, but because I had wanted to retire into fatherhood and grandfatherhood cleanly, without the weight of what I'd spent decades doing following me into Sunday dinners and birthday parties. I had wanted to just be her dad. "I worked for the federal government," I said. "Financial crimes. 34 years. Senior special agent." She was quiet for so long I watched the road. "The FBI?" "Yes." "And you never all the times Beverly said you were," she stopped. "A nobody? A man who lived simply and didn't amount to much?" I kept my voice gentle. "I know what they thought. I let them think it." "Why?" "Because people who believe you're powerless will show you everything. They won't bother to hide." Claire leaned her head back against the seat. Sophie slept on in the back, one hand curled around her sunflowers. "They showed you a lot," Claire said finally. "They did. And the phone calls were to people who know how to look at the right things." She didn't ask more. We drove the rest of the way in the particular quiet of people who have understood something important and don't need to fill it with words. The next 3 weeks moved the way these things move when the right machinery gets engaged. Danny called me 6 days after the recital. "Bob, you were right to call." His voice had the particular flatness he used when something was worse than expected. "Whitfield Property Group has been misclassifying commercial tenants for tax purposes for at least 7 years. We're talking about significant, unreported income. Donnie's name is on the shell structures. There's also something interesting about a city contract from 2019, a commercial development bid that looks like someone had advanced knowledge of the competing offer. Bit rigging. That's the working theory. I'm bringing in 2 other agents. This is going to be a formal investigation, Bob. You understand it's out of your hands from here. That's exactly where I want it. 2 days after that, Patricia Odom called. The tenant complaints were there. 3 separate renters filed with the city over the past 4 years about lease irregularities, fees charged that weren't in contracts, security deposits improperly withheld. The complaints were closed without action. We're reopening them and looking at whether anyone in the city office had a reason to see them closed. Thank you, Pat. Don't thank me. This is our job. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call Beverly. I didn't tell Claire everything. Not yet. Only that things were in motion, and she should speak with a family law attorney. A recommendation I delivered over the phone one Sunday morning, the first Sunday call we'd had in almost 3 years. A family law attorney, she repeated. Someone good. Someone you trust. I can give you a name if you want one. A pause. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying you have options, Claire. I'm saying you are not trapped. I'm saying whatever you decide, I am here, she cried. Not dramatically, not with explanation, just quietly, the way you cry when something you've been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to be put down. I've wanted to leave for 2 years, she said. I just couldn't. I didn't know how. You do know how. You just needed to remember. She called the attorney the following week, a woman named Gail Tompkins, who had handled family law in Savannah for 20 years and who had a reputation for methodical, thorough, and unsentimental precision. I knew her by reputation from my years working cases that occasionally intersected with domestic financial disputes. She was exactly who Claire needed. Gail moved quickly. She documented 6 years of financial control. Marcus had handled all the accounts, given Claire a household allowance that required approval for any expenditure over $200, and had quietly moved a portion of their joint savings into an account in his mother's name approximately 8 months after the wedding. Claire hadn't known about the last part until Gail found it. Marcus's response, when Claire served him papers, was loud and prolonged. He arrived at my house in Beaufort on a Tuesday evening without calling ahead, which was the first time he'd ever come to my house at all. He stood on my porch with his face arranged in the expression of a man performing controlled anger. You did this, he said. You turned her against me. I invited him inside. He didn't move. Your daughter would have been fine if you hadn't interfered. This is a family matter, Robert. I agree, I said, which is why I'd like you to speak more quietly. My neighbors don't need to hear this. I don't care what your neighbors. Marcus. I kept my voice level. Claire is my family. Sophie is my family. Whatever happens between you and Claire in the next few months, I want you to understand something clearly. I let a moment pass. I spent 34 years as a senior special agent in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I still have active relationships with the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit and the Georgia Attorney General's Office. I am telling you this not as a threat, but as information, because I think you deserve the opportunity to make good decisions going forward. The color changed in his face. Not all at once. Gradually, the way water changes temperature. You're what? Retired, but professionally connected, and very attentive to the details of my family's situation. He left without saying anything else. I watched his car pull out of my driveway and sat back down in my kitchen with my coffee and my notepad and wrote down the time and date of the visit, as I had written down everything else. The investigation into Whitfield Property Group became public 6 weeks after the recital. The Savannah Morning News ran a story about a federal inquiry into tax irregularities and potential bid rigging connected to a 2019 city development contract. Donnie was named. Beverly was named as a board member. The company's operations were suspended pending review. Marcus was not named in the federal investigation, but Gail's work had surfaced the diverted joint savings $47,000 moved without Claire's knowledge or consent, which constituted financial fraud under Georgia law. Marcus's attorney contacted Gail within 48 hours of the divorce filing to discuss settlement terms. He wants to settle quickly, Gail told Claire, before anything else surfaces. Does that mean what I think it means? Claire asked. It means he believes there may be more to find, Gail said. and he doesn't want a thorough accounting of the last 6 years. The settlement was generous. The house, full custody of Sophie with reasonable visitation, child support at an amount that accounted for Marcus's actual income, rather than the reduced figure his attorney had initially proposed. Gale was precise and relentless, and Marcus's side folded on nearly every point. On the afternoon the settlement was signed, Claire called me from Gale's office parking lot. "It's done, Dad. How do you feel?" She thought about it. Like I remembered how to breathe. Beverly called me once, about 2 weeks after Donnie's name appeared in the paper. I didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway, old habits. Robert. Her voice was different. The architecture of it was the same, the control and the cadence, but something underneath had changed. "I wanted to speak with you directly." "Oh, right." A pause. "I understand you were involved in what's happened." "I reported existing concerns to appropriate authorities, Beverly. I didn't create the concerns. Donald and your company created those over many years. You could have come to us. You could have said something." I kept my voice entirely neutral. I think we both know how that would have gone. I was the man who drove a 10-year-old truck and lived in a small house in Beaufort. I was the furniture. Silence. "You have to understand," she said finally, "that I didn't know all of what Donnie was doing. That may be true. The investigation will determine what you knew and when." A beat. "Beverly, I hope you get good counsel. I genuinely mean that." She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. 34 years of working financial crime had taught me something about people like Beverly Whitfield. They weren't always evil in the mustache-twirling sense. Many of them were simply people who had never been told no by anyone with the standing to make it stick, who had been surrounded for so long by people calculating their own angles that accountability had become an abstract concept, something that happened to other people, lesser people, people without the right last name. The consequences arrived, the way consequences do when the paperwork is thorough, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long, steady cascade. Donnie was formally charged 8 weeks after the investigation became public. 3 counts of tax fraud, 2 counts related to bid rigging. His attorney, a polished man from Atlanta whose suit probably cost more than my truck, filed motions that delayed things but did not change the direction they were heading. Beverly stepped down from the Whitfield Property Group board after the Georgia Real Estate Commission opened a separate licensing review. A community organization she'd chaired for 12 years asked for her resignation during their spring board meeting, which was noted in the same local paper that had once covered her charity galas. Marcus, facing a divorce settlement that required full financial transparency, accepted terms and moved into a rental apartment near the Savannah waterfront. His letters to Claire, stiff, formal, occasionally self-pitying, went unanswered. He showed up for his visitation with Sophie on schedule and behaved correctly in those hours, which was what mattered. Sophie, for her part, had gone back to dance class. Her teacher told Claire that Sophie had shown up the Tuesday after the recital with a new level of focus. When Claire asked Sophie about it, Sophie had said, "Grandpa Robert says that what other people think about what you're doing doesn't matter as much as whether you keep doing it." She'd paused and added, "Also, he said, Uncle Donnie was rude, and rude people are usually scared of something." I said the first part, I told Claire when she relayed this. I don't remember the second part. "She made it up," Claire said. "But she's not wrong." Claire and Sophie moved into a townhouse in a neighborhood called Ardsley Park, close enough to good schools and a small yard where Sophie wanted to start a garden. It was 3 houses from a park where they could walk in the evenings. I drove up to help them move on a Saturday morning in early June, and we spent the day in the good exhaustion of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture and finding out that the kitchen drawer stuck and needed to be forced open. Over lunch, sandwiches on the floor because the table wasn't assembled yet, Sophie informed me that she wanted a telescope. I put down my sandwich. "What kind?" I said. "A good one. For looking at planets." Claire caught my eye across the pile of packing paper. Something passed between us, the particular look of people who share a long enough history to communicate in glances. "We can find a good one," I said. That evening, after Sophie was in bed in her new room with the window facing east, Claire and I sat on the front steps with cups of coffee. The June evening was warm and humming with the sounds of the neighborhood settling into summer. "Dad," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Those first weeks, after the recital, when you were making calls, talking to people, Did you know how it would end up? Did you plan all of it? I thought about this honestly. I knew that Donald and Beverly had been operating in ways that wouldn't survive scrutiny. I knew that the right people, looking carefully, would find things. I didn't know the embezzlement angle, or how far the tax situation went. Some of it surprised me. But you started it. I reported a crime I witnessed. A grown man mocking a child in public, with her parents standing there unable to stop it because of the power dynamic that family had spent years building. And I made sure that the same people who believed themselves untouchable got some of the scrutiny they'd avoided for too long. I paused. I didn't fabricate anything, Claire. I never misused anything. I just knew where to look and who to call. She was quiet for a moment. 6 years, she said. All of that was happening for 6 years. And you just watched. I watched. I visited when I was allowed. I sent Sophie sunflowers because she told me once that they looked like the sun had come down to visit. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. I could have said something to Marcus early on, revealed who I was to Beverly, made sure they understood the implications of how they were treating you. And every time I considered it, I thought if I do that, they'll perform better. They'll hide. I won't see what's really there. And you might not believe it, because they'll have learned to be more careful. I looked at her, so I waited, and they showed me everything. I should have left sooner. You left when you were ready. That's not a failure. She leaned her head on my shoulder the same way she had when she was 11 years old, and her mother had just been diagnosed, and we were sitting on different steps on a different porch, and she hadn't had the words yet for how scared she was. I put my arm around her now the same way I had then. I used to call you every Sunday, she said. I know. I missed it. I told myself it was just that things were busy, that it wasn't important, but I missed it. So did I. She lifted her head and looked at me. I found the Sunday calls again, she said. Can we have them back? Every week, I said. Same as before. The fireflies were starting up in the yard across the street. Down the block, someone was playing music on a porch, something with a slow guitar. Sophie's window had gone dark. I thought about what Claire had asked whether I'd planned it all. The honest answer was more complicated than yes or no. I had 34 years of training that made me see patterns in information, connect threads that looked unrelated, know which calls to make and who would answer. I had a network built over decades that remained loyal because I had always been loyal to it. I had patience, which is just attention held over time. What I had not planned was the moment in the recital corridor, kneeling down to hand my granddaughter sunflowers, watching Donnie Whitfield lean in with his flask breath and his contempt, and choose a child as the target of whatever small cruelty was available to him that afternoon. I had not planned Marcus laughing. I had not planned the particular look on Sophie's face in the moment before she understood that the adults around her were not going to fix this. That moment had not required a plan. It had required a grandfather. Everything else was just knowing how systems work. In October, I received a call from Danny Kowalski. Donnie had accepted a plea agreement, 2 counts of tax fraud, 1 count of bid rigging, 18 months in federal prison, full restitution, permanent bar from serving as an officer in any company holding federal contracts. Beverly's case was resolved separately, cooperation with the investigation in exchange for a civil penalty and the loss of her real estate license. She had, as far as anyone could determine, genuinely not known the full extent of Donnie's activities. The system had worked the way it was designed to work. I drove up to Savannah the following Saturday for Sophie's next recital. She had a bigger part this time. She was still not the most technically precise child in the class, and she still didn't care, and watching her not care was one of the most hopeful things I'd seen in years. She moved like the music was something she owned personally. At one point she made eye contact with me in the 3rd row and gave me a grin so enormous that I laughed out loud before I could stop myself, which made the woman next to me laugh too, which made the whole row feel briefly, warmly human. Afterward in the corridor, she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the exit. Grandpa Robert, I have to show you something. All right, it's outside. Come on. She pulled me through the door into the October evening. The sky was doing something extraordinary. A pale apricot sunset behind the Spanish moss on the live oaks. Sophie stopped and pointed straight up. The first star, she said. See it? Right there. I looked. There it was. One point of light in a sky that wasn't quite dark yet, steady and indifferent and beautiful. Venus, I said. Technically a planet, not a star. But it counts. Everything counts, Sophie said seriously. We stood there a moment, the two of us, looking up. Claire came out behind us and slipped her hand into my arm and looked where we were looking. What are we seeing? She asked. Venus, Sophie said. Grandpa says it counts. Everything counts, Claire said, and I could hear in her voice that she meant something larger than planets. Later that night, after Sophie was delivered to Marcus for his weekend visit and Claire and I were at the same fish restaurant with the wooden tables, she asked me something I'd been waiting for without knowing it. Dad, what was the thing you were most afraid of? Through all of it, I thought about it. That you'd stay, I said finally. Not because leaving was the only right choice, but because I was afraid you'd stay without choosing to. That the situation would just continue indefinitely, because the inertia was too great and the door felt locked, and you'd wake up in 20 years and realize you'd spent your whole life in a house where you'd stopped being a person. I paused. I was afraid you'd disappear completely. She was quiet. I was almost there, she said. I know. The recital, Sophie crying. That was... She stopped. I wanted to say something. I wanted to turn to Marcus and say something real, something that mattered, and I couldn't. I physically couldn't find the words. Like they'd been taken out of me one at a time over 6 years, and I hadn't noticed each one go. She looked at her hands on the table, and then you stood up, and you were just calm. And you said, "Excuse me," and walked away. And something in me thought, he knows what he's doing. He always knows what he's doing, and I should trust that. You should trust yourself, I said. You found the words eventually. You said, "I'd like that," when I offered dinner. You said I should have walked out years ago. You said, "I want the Sunday calls back." Those were your words, Claire, not mine. She looked at me for a long moment. You're doing that thing where you give me the credit. I'm doing that thing where I tell the truth. The restaurant was filling up around us, families and couples, and a table of college students, loud with the particular joy of people who don't yet know enough to be tired. Life going on in all its ordinary, relentless way. We ordered dessert, which was not something I usually did, but Sophie had texted from Marcus's with a picture of his dog and 3 heart emojis, and I was in the kind of mood that says yes to pie. I thought about Beverly, leading whatever smaller life she was building in the wake of everything. About Donnie, somewhere in the process of facing what he'd built and what it had cost. About Marcus, learning to be Sophie's father in 2-day increments, which was perhaps not the worst situation for either of them. I thought about 34 years of cases, criminals who had believed that their networks and their money and their careful construction of plausible distance from their own crimes made them safe. Most of them had been wrong, not because the system was perfect, it wasn't. It isn't. But because systems worked when the right people worked them, when the right calls were made, when someone with enough knowledge and enough patience and enough genuine fury at what had been done to people they loved decided that the inertia would stop here. "Dad," Claire said, "what are you thinking about?" I came back to the table, the wood grain under my hands, the pie neither of us had started yet. "Sunday calls," I said. She smiled. The shadows had been gone from her eyes for months now. She laughed differently fully, without checking first to see if it was permitted. "Sunday calls," she said. Every week. Every week. Outside, the Savannah evening was full of that particular October warmth that doesn't apologize for still being here when the calendar says otherwise. Somewhere across town, Sophie was probably already telling Marcus about Venus and how her grandfather said it counted. I have spent my life in the work of understanding how things connect, how money moves through structures designed to conceal it, how patterns of behavior leave traces that compound over time, how people who believe themselves invisible are in fact the most visible of all, to anyone willing to look carefully. I had looked carefully for 6 years. I had waited until the moment that required action rather than patience. I had made 2 phone calls in a parking lot and trusted the machinery I had spent a career building to move in the direction of what was right. None of it was complicated. In the end, none of it required anything more than knowing who you were and what you owed the people who needed you. I was a grandfather. I was a father. I was, in a past life that remained usefully present, a man who knew how crimes were built and how they came apart. I was, most importantly, the person who brought Sophie sunflowers and remembered that they were her favorite. That was enough. That had always been enough. I just hadn't needed them to know it until I did. If this story meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe to Stormborn Vengeance. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. For the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for being here.